going live. We're live.
Woohoo!
Hey, YouTube viewers, this is your host, Steven, and I'm here with Roberto again. We're going to continue our conversation from last time, looking at parallels between Rome and America, and generally talking about Western civilization. Roberto's going to start things off. He has a comment or question. I'm interested to hear what it is.
Yeah. Thank you, Aurelian, for having me back on your show, and thanks to the viewers. Yeah. So last time I think we discussed the ideals of the Roman Republic and the relationship to like the modern age. Basically, the fact that the aristocracy, landowning aristocracies, kind of invent these ideologies of limited government to try to basically try to resist power from on high, a demagogue, a centralized power, but also resist the power from on low. So the landowners have constructed an ideology in ancient Rome and in the early American Republic to basically protect their own interests. Like the Federalist Papers were basically basically the most important line of the Federalist Papers is Madison saying, we don't want democracy, right? We want a republic so that our property is protected, and we don't want everybody voting, right? We don't want universal suffrage because then they're going to vote to take our property away. That's exactly the concerns of the ancient Roman Republic, right? That's why they killed the Gracchi brothers, because they wanted everybody to have the right to vote in Rome. Ultimately, what happened, I think, is the Italians, non-Roman Italians, earned the right to vote after the Social War. They became citizens, I think.
Yes.
Right. So I'm sure their voting rights were limited, but I think but that actually happened after the fall of the Republic, right? Or was
No.
Okay, it was before the fall of the. Oh, okay. So after the fall of the Republic in the 3rd century, there was universal citizenship, right?
In the early, I think it's 212.
212, yeah, right.
It was
Well,
a degenerate sort.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Let me get to my question. So
Sure.
I think we've
That's a good recap.
Right. Yeah. Okay, great. This idea of a proposition nation, one of the problems that conservatives, like nationalists, and also the alternative right, which is becoming important now in view of Donald Trump, interestingly, the alternative right and people like Sam Dixon, they don't like this idea of a proposition nation, right? America is a proposition nation whose identity, well, there really is no identity. The identity is based on an idea of limited government. Basically, fill in the blank. We have rights. That's what it means to be an American, and protecting these rights are what it means to be American. Couldn't the same thing be said of Rome, right? It didn't premise its identity on any kind of firm substance the way that Indians and Chinese do, right? They have their identities are based on ideals too, but to them, what's most important is we're Indians, we're Chinese. This is our race, this is our culture. For the Romans, they let everybody be Roman, right? That's in a sense the Roman aristocracy. They felt they had something to protect rights, but also privilege. But I guess these kind of the ideational values that they upheld were accessible by basically anybody.
That's a great point. Now, unlike I think in this country, even though this country was founded by generally like English, Anglo-Saxon descendants and what have you, Rome did have a culture, but I think over time, and you see a lot of, the records talk about, especially among the senatorial class, like as the empire expanded, you had a lot of influences from abroad, whether it be Celtic or Eastern, and the Roman elite tried to they scorned or they want to insulate the society, true Romans from these influences because they thought it would dilute the culture and what made Romans, right? Yeah. Over the course of time, as the empire grew, I think out of necessity in order to kind of facilitate, kind of the acceptance of the conquered toward the new status quo under Roman hegemony, to extend to them certain protections that initially were only given to fellow Latins, right? Because the Romans were a Latin tribe. And in the process, I think the empire became more ideational, as you mentioned, and more of a proposition. This concept of like of government and civic order, that they posit as being universal. And but then even then they tried to society was stratified between Roman citizens and the slaves and non-citizens, right? How even in this society, how initially it was white property owners, not in every state, but generally speaking, that was who was allowed to vote. I mean, New Jersey allowed women to vote if they had some property quota, and then I think freedmen could vote in other states. But for the most part, it was that was the limit set. But and what you see with the Romans as you reach, especially with 212 when Caracalla gives everyone citizenship, there's no real sense of, there's no distinctive Roman identity becomes less distinctive. It just becomes everyone who's living under the empire. And and it's ironic because then you could look at maybe why Christianity was necessary.
As a unifier,
as a unifying element, because before you had kind of like an aspiration, right? And I don't want to make it the American dream because it's not in the same sense, but like you could aspire to be a Roman citizen if you served in the army, or if you were prominent within your own community. Certain provincials would be granted citizenship, which when Caracalla did what he did, he eliminated that. So then, and you have convulsions of the 3rd century, obviously, that really put Rome to the breaking point. So I do, going back to, I guess, your original comment. Yes, I do think as the Roman Latin element became less, kind of subsumed in this entire, this very polyglot empire. It became tougher and tougher to bind together. Increasing use of it was by military force and violence that upheld the order, and kind of in these myths, and that's why maybe the Jews were so intolerable. In many respects, because in order to preserve order, they need everyone to buy into the emperor as this mythic figure, and they refused to do so, and that damaged the legitimacy of the state.
But still, the idea of Rome maintained its prestige, right? So, ideally, the idea of Rome, it was identified military prestige, but that's interesting that you mentioned that. So initially, the Roman idea, at least what I think, what's his name, Virgil would tell us, the guy who kind of, was he the one who wrote a lot of Roman history and kind of explained it in terms that we understand?
Well, Livy has Livy's the Roman historian, but then Virgil provides the founding myth. But he writes this during the age of Augustus. He writes the Aeneid then, so it's basically propaganda. It's not, it's not history. He's linking, because Octavian.
It's basically that you take a founding figure or a mythic idea and place him in history to legitimize the project. But anyway, back to the point we've been making. Initially, the idea of Roman exceptionalism was that you bought into the citizen idea, right? And even Paul says, when he's about to be arrested by the Romans, he says, "I'm a Roman citizen," and then they leave him alone because there's an exceptionalism, and this is still that's within a century of the Roman Republic falling. He went through what he went through during the 40s and 50s AD. So in the early Roman Empire, during the early Principate, right, there's still this sense of there's still a kind of sentimentalism attached to having the right to vote, having some kind of access to government power that common citizens can have. And one of the ways that the Romans kind of bribed people into joining the project of expanding the empire is by conferring citizenship onto people. So I think the idea of citizenship was just as much ideally important, but practically and instrumentally just as important, right? Because it was a means by which the empire was bound together. Basically, you can get collaborators, local collaborators, non-Italian collaborators. So yeah, I think that's key. But in terms of the late Roman Empire as the dominate, right, when they became dictatorial, but ironically, that's when they expand citizenship to everybody. So it's funny how like demagoguery or how do you say dictatorship is linked to the masses, and that's why, as we've discussed before, Caesar and Marius and I would say Augustus too, kind of link their dictatorships to the popular masses. It's really interesting how, in a sense, the preservers of freedom and rights have been the elites, and it's fascinating too, because we think of the Roman aristocracy has its rights to preserve. The Magna Carta came into being not on behalf of individual citizens, but
Yes, it's a great point.
Right, but of the nobility in Norman ruled England, in Norman ruled British Isles, right? The people who forged the Magna Carta were interested in protecting aristocratic privilege. So classical liberalism was first articulated not by the middle class, even though it became identified with middle class rights. It was first articulated by aristocratic, by noble intellectuals, in France and in England, because they had a stake in protecting their property from
Their own privileges.
Right, yeah. So yeah, what do you think of that?
No, I think it's phenomenal. You're looking into the broader European Western context. It's ironic in many ways, and the people who write history almost entirely have come from that segment of society, the nobility, the aristocracy, generally the elites,
Right.
and in feudal, and it's all, and our concept of rights and liberties really stems from their own experience trying to resist a centralized authority, which more often than not is supported by the great mass of citizens. I mean, there's exceptions, right? When you have like obviously a tyrannical figure, you have popular riots against him, but typically speaking, you have a nobility. The Magna Carta is a great example. And it's not even just in England, but like you mentioned, France, the Estates General, in Spain, the various Cortes. You have these, and over time they get eroded, right? As the crown exerts its independence from, and these institutions fall, not so much in England, ironically, but in France and Spain, definitely. The Cortes and Estates General, kind of lose their import. But, these functions are, kind of the whole European. In many cases in Europe, Bernard Luce would say this otherwise, right? He talks about Islam, the Middle East being by, this ultimate rule by consent.
Yeah.
But at least that might have been in practice, but but in de jure, legally speaking, in the West, there's always been more limitations. You've had like a more vibrant aristocracy than you've had in other places.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's such a fascinating history, and it just never ends, right? But like, we talked about the Roman Republic, and this is where I kind of have to come to you with questions, because I don't know the details as well. It seems like Cato and Cicero were kind of these, maybe more Cato than Cicero, but from what I know of them, or the impression I get, these are like aristocratic era conservatives, in the sense that, and it's funny, is conservative back then was identified with limited government, just like in the United States.
It is, yeah.
And that's funny. And I say that as someone who's been critical of that attitude, but it actually is rooted in a core Western theme of Western history. So Cicero and Cato, they're anti-corruption. They seem to be. I think I'm talking about Cato the Younger here, right? Around that time is when they start articulating these kind of sentiments of limited government and aristocratic privilege and rights, is that it's probably a reaction against the new theme or the new habit of these generals, right, who are going to the people for power. Like there was in the Senate, there was a stigma against Roman senators and politicians going to the people and offering them stuff, right? You didn't do that, right? Because it was a power grab. But the point I'm trying to make, and trying to link it to the Enlightenment, necessity is the mother of invention. The people who invented, who rearticulated this idea of classical liberalism were aristocrats who were living during the time of royal absolutism. So like royal absolutism begins in Spain in the late 15th century, continues through the 1500s, and it really reaches its crescendo during the 1600s. Maybe the Enlightenment of Locke and these other these other people with noble origin, it's a reaction of the aristocracy against the centralized authority of the kings, right? J. Stephen Roberts in Real Crusades History, I think he said, when he explained in one of his videos about monarchy, during the late Middle Ages and the high Middle Ages, kings had to consult with, like, as we mentioned, with other nobles. So you had the round table thing, like we talk about in King Arthur and in Kingdom of Heaven. You know, what say this concept is what Rene de Chatillon, is that his name?
Renaud de Chatillon, yeah.
Right. Doesn't he say, he asks his counselors. But then something later happens, as J. Stephen Roberts says, there's monarchical absolutism, which has an ideological content to it. The Enlightenment was a reaction against that, right? We think of the Enlightenment as a reaction against the wars of religion, but maybe it was just aristocrats and elites and even maybe middle class, wealthier people need to find a reason to articulate kind of anti-absolutism. So what do you think of that?
No, it's funny. I think people overemphasize the religious context because, because the glorious Locke is writing in England specifically in 1688. 1688, you have the Glorious Revolution in England. You're overthrowing a Catholic monarch, and I think to Protestants they associate absolutism with Catholicism, and there's some basis to that. I won't dismiss that entirely, but I think, like you said, it's more a reaction toward centralized authority and reasserting the rights of the nobility. And feudalism is actually somewhat republican, system in that there's a recognition of limit. There's a limit of powers and consent of rule, right? With feudal privileges, there's a quid pro quo. The monarch's authority isn't absolute. Because the Wars of Religion ended in 1648, right? And then you really don't have a lot of these things. They don't start writing really until the late 17th century, early 18th century, right? And then the classic example of royal absolutism is Louis the 14th, the Sun King, in the Court of Versailles.
Right.
And this image of a subject nobility trying to curry favor with the monarch in these elaborate ceremonies in the court, and it was, and in Louis's mind, it was a way to kind of keep the nobility quiescent, give them some sort of role, as he pretty much took all their powers. But then in the monarch in the French context, right? You had the French Wars of Religion, you have the Fronde, you had the nobility had really caused a lot of havoc in France specifically, right? So, and a lot of these things we're talking about, maybe France and England, right? Montesquieu, Rousseau, these people, they're so the monarchy's objective, they crush the nobilities. They're in a position to assert their dominance over them. But then you have the reaction saying, like, but we have these rights, right? And then these rights start to extend toward the general populace as the 18th century progresses, and really, when you get the French Revolution, all chaos breaks loose because until that moment, there had been kind of like three. You have like the monarch, the nobility. Nobility and clergy are kind of on the same level to some degree. And then
Right.
you have everyone else, and that was the basic societal structure in Europe for well over 1,000 years. I mean, it took time to develop, and like the power between the relative branches varied, right? But like that had been balanced, and that gets smashed in 1789.
Wow. Wow.
But this larger, this larger, these ideas, they go back to Rome. I mean, even the Greeks to some extent, right?
Right.
Um, Even though with going back to the Greeks is kind of problematic, we tend to associate Athens, but Athens was very much an exception within Greece. I mean, like, that was the lone democracy. It wasn't the lone democracy. It was the majority of the states were run by tyrants
Yeah.
or oligarchies. But by using Athens as kind of like the main focal point of resistance, we
Right.
make it to the struggle again for the democracy versus despotism. But in Persia or the East in general, there was this, the Greeks clearly didn't want to subject themselves to this all-powerful ruler with no
Yeah.
limits on his power, none whatsoever. So
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
these rights kind of stem from aristocratic history,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
in the elite history.
The oligarchical interest. I wanted to ask you about Cicero, who I've been meaning to ask you. I went to Wikipedia's page, and in the first paragraph, it's like the most glowing thing you will ever see. They talk about he's one of the most influential figures of the Renaissance. Like they basically say the Renaissance is basically a revival of Cicero. He also influenced these Enlightenment figures like David Hume, Locke. Wikipedia quotes American founders talking about how he's just the most brilliant person in the world in human history. On the one hand, well, for basically defending the rights of the privileged against Caesar's populism. But then they quote Nietzsche, who hates democracy, and Nietzsche says, "Let me see." He's the most contemptible scoundrel in history. No, not Nietzsche. Friedrich Engels, this makes sense. Who is of Marxism, the co-founder, and he hated him, right, because Cicero upheld Republican democracy, right, but at the same time denounced land and class reforms, right. So obviously he hates the popularities who are trying to do redistribution of land and democratizing the citizenry, giving everybody suffrage. Uh, who is like? What's the significance of Cicero, and how is he different from Cato?
Well, Cicero, well, first of all, Cato came from this patrician family. Cicero was
Okay.
what you would call a novus homo. He was very much a self-made man, but he became not one of the more ardent defenders of the Senate aristocracy. I mean, Cicero, unlike Cato, I mean, Cato was a great orator too, but Cicero he's this lasted posterity because of his writings that have survived to the present. A lot of his orations and his style, because bear in mind, Latin was the lingua franca of Europe for, I would say, until pretty much the rise of French, the rise of France as a dominant power. So well over 1,000 years, probably looking 1700s, Latin was the language of the intellectuals. So Cicero's the father of kind of Latin prose. So there's that. And because his writings survive, we know a lot about him. We know his life story. And and he was Cicero was a consul. The Catiline conspiracy, where Catiline was kind of this guy who was not as successful as Caesar, but he was in the popularis element.
Right.
He kind of attracted these discontent elements of society and rebellion that Cicero helped to defeat. But it's funny about Cicero. Cicero does reconcile with Caesar for a time, and he's not involved in the assassination of Caesar. He's deliberately kept out by Brutus and Cassius.
Oh, okay.
But Cicero had a great personal animus toward Mark Antony. And then during the second triumvirate, And because Cicero had written against polemics against Antony, to publicly condemned him.
Right.
Because he viewed Antony as more of a menace, I guess, than Caesar ever was. So they had a prescription, which is they killed people and and confiscated their properties. Antony insisted that Cicero be included. Octavian initially resisted because Octavian had been kind of like he kind of had worked with Cicero. Cicero had kind of helped him along, made him consul, the youngest consul in history.
Right.
And he killed. So they have him killed, and then Antony has Cicero's hands cut off and posted in front of the Senate House as a reminder, because Cicero was just this famous orator, and he would use his hands, kind of like a New York. How New Yorkers speak with their hands today. Cicero used his hands to kind of add drama and effect to his oratory, and so they killed him. So I guess given what survived from that era, given and also the talent, the quality of his work.
Yeah.
He's been so influential in poetry, rhetoric, prose, law. He was a great lawyer. He was part of the case against the corrupt governor of Sicily, Varus.
Mm-hmm.
So he's just more so than Cato. Even Cato's kind of like, he's kind of in the mold of Ted Cruz. Cato's like this very principled, while Cicero was a little bit more pragmatic, I don't think he disagreed Cato with too much, but Cato would die for his principles. Cato committed suicide before surrendering to Caesar. Cicero decided to stay around for a bit.
Right. It's interesting about Cicero. The reason it seems like he's been claimed by people of various ideological agendas, right? Obviously the Marxists hate him, but it seems like the early American Republic, right? Some of them called him like the first articulator, an early articulator of like the idea of liberty, right? And he's lionized for that. You can look it on the Cicero's Wikipedia page. Jefferson loves him. They use him as like the basis for claiming a right to revolution, but also Martin Luther invokes Cicero. Cicero is the subject of appropriation by a number of different people. It seems like Cicero, also the church fathers, apparently Augustine of Hippo basically invokes him. It seems like he's like one of the most enduring figures in European history during all the eras of the age. So like it's I think we could probably do an entire video on Cicero himself. But what did the Romans consider to be what was a Roman for when they were expanding, and was it an Italian? Was it somebody of Italian origin? And was there ever a need to like clarify what a Roman was, or like who?
I don't think you had necessarily the identity politics of today. I don't think it was that incredibly nuanced, because a lot of people have a lot of academics have a lot of free time nowadays. Kind of go into these things. But initially, it was very much like an insulated society. A Roman would be someone from the city of Rome, right? They were distinct from the other Latins, right? But then as they expanded, they kind of made fellow Latins equals on terms, because Rome was assumed primacy within the Latin League at the time it was called.
Right.
This is going back to like 4th, 5th century BC. This is a long time ago. But even it takes a while, because the social war is not, I believe it takes place in the 70s, 80s BC. Mm-hmm. Cicero, actually, that was his taste of military action, actually, as a young man. The other Italians were not afforded they were not considered Roman, right? But I think as the empire expanded, you had military colonies that were established throughout the empire. So you had Roman citizens spread out, and you were sort of centers of Roman culture. Roman identity became more ubiquitous, and so it really changed over time. But like anything, it started off in a city that, legend have it, was founded by criminals, and the less savory elements of society with the kidnap of the Sabine woman. They invite the Sabines. There was no woman; it was just all men. They invite these Sabine, and they kidnap them from their families, and they rape them, and then. But then and after the Sabine men come back with forces to like retake their women, but like the women are all pregnant, and they say they love their Roman husbands now, so not to fight. So they establish some sort. So it's kind of that's myth.
Yeah, yeah.
But yes, but it kind of ties into what the original premise of our conversation about, like, did this kind of the spread of the enfranchisement of larger elements of society, that kind of undo the empire but in the process, kind of the idea of Rome became more and more abstract and broad, because it could no longer be that an Italian or was just a Roman. It was
Right.
you had emperors from like Spain and from at the time Illyria Dalmatia, which is like Croatia, all over the place. And some of them were of Italian origin, some of them weren't.
Yeah.
But they considered themselves to be Roman. So it's as time went on, as the empire expanded, due to necessity,
Right.
more and more people considered themselves Romans.
A lot of it probably had to do with the language, right? Like, I know they placed a great emphasis on Latin speaking, so that probably had, to the extent that they pondered on these things at all. Like, I have a feeling, as you mentioned, that it was a lot more simple back then. Like, like today we invent these entire discourses of identity politics, and a lot of it just came down to what language you spoke. One thing that's interesting to me is, this is a question for you. I noticed that the Roman conquest of Western Europe, right, is extremely brutal. Like, Caesar brags about killing 1 million people in Gaul.
Yeah, it was huge.
Right. They slaughter all these people, the Celts in the British Isles, Spain, the Celts too. There, they annihilate Carthage. It's really brutal. But the Roman conquest of Greece was nowhere near as bloody. Like, there's Corinth, but of Greece,
Yes, it's Corinth.
of the Levant is nowhere near as bloody. Egypt, there's no bloodbath in Egypt, right? What's going on there? Like, why is that? Like, any ideas or possibilities?
I don't want to attribute larger like trends, like the distinction between East. There's always distinction between East and West, but like the Gallic resistance was very fierce, right? So and some of it was provoked, some of it wasn't. So Caesar had to use a heavy hand to, and also bear in mind it was I think the character of the regions as well. Spain and Gaul, as it was known at the time, they were tribal societies, fiercely independent. They weren't organized under kingdoms. So like in the East, right, like, and to the Egyptians, it's just another dynasty coming through. Like Egyptians had not been ruled by Egyptians for centuries. Or like we've been ruled by Greeks for a few hundred years. Now we're gonna get ruled by like Romans. Like I think there was a less of, it was easier for them to reconcile the idea of conquest as opposed to these people who had never really been conquered, fiercely independent, and they were desirous of their freedom. So the Romans, against the Lusitanians and the Cantabrian Wars and Spain, and obviously the Gallic Wars, a lot of people died. A lot of, even in Britain, the Iceni, Boudica, these people, they fought viciously and had to be put down viciously because the Romans needed to leave their imprint. I think with Carthage, a lot of the Phoenician cities or the Punic cities, they surrendered, they gave in. But I think the Romans had a personal animus toward Carthage. And their Punic War was not, they were the Romans. I think it was one of Cato's ancestors. He would end every speech in his head with like "Carthago delenda est," which means Carthage must be destroyed.
Wow.
and the Carthaginians were just in such, they were just in this terrible predicament. They, you know, the Romans were allied with the Numidians, and Numidians were encroaching on Carthage's land, but the peace treaty from the Second Punic War dictated that like Carthage couldn't go to war without Roman permission. But of course, the Romans are not going to tell their ally to stop attacking Carthage.
Yeah.
So Carthage is like, do we just let ourselves, like, do we let the Numidians just like conquer us, or we're going to resist? So they resist, and the Romans are like, oh, look, you guys are defying the treaty as an excuse to destroy you. So they just had this personal animus toward Carthage, and so the Carthaginians really had no chance. But that's distinct. But I think in the Western Spain, Gaul, Britain, these tribal societies, that had not, and Corinth is really the only example in the East of that. That was the Greeks were also kind of like, you know, they resisted the Macedonians, right? And that was kind of the impetus that they invited the Romans in because they didn't want Macedon to, you know, assert to conquer to conquer them. And these other Mithridates and the Seleucids, all these Eastern potentates who want to like unite the Hellenic world.
Right.
That's what brings the Romans in, because just these, you know, it was kind of after the death of Alexander, no one could really unite these territories that had been united briefly, but they had in common they were all ruled by, you know, Greek dynasties. But you know, these people were, I guess I hate to say it, but they were just used to being ruled. They were more amenable to it in the East, and in the West they were just like, you know, we've never submitted to anyone, and we're not going to submit to you.
Right.
So in the Siege of Alesia, which is kind of like the last stand of the Gauls, Vercingetorix, you know, Caesar, and kind of a brilliant strategy. So Alesia is a city. Caesar is besieging it. Gets word that like he claims 200,000 Gallic reinforcements.
Right.
You know, ancient number we don't really know, but it probably was more than what Caesar had, and then combined with what was inside Alesia could have overwhelmed him. So he built like this fortress around Alesia, walls on both sides.
Wow.
But as the siege is going on at Alesia, Vercingetorix later is like, we don't have enough food to feed the soldiers and the women and children. So he tells the women and children to leave in the hopes that Caesar will it'll hurt Caesar's supplies, right? So he lets them out of the gates. And I can only imagine how horrible that that was, and the women and children just starved to death.
Wow.
Because Caesar he's not going to help them out because he knows what Vercingetorix is doing.
Yeah.
So you just have to, and then these are their own women and children. So it must have been so demoralizing for these Gauls to see their own women and children dying.
Yeah.
Outside, but in Vercingetorix's mind, we need to you know, sustain ourselves.
Right.
And think of that, he could have submitted to the Romans, Vercingetorix, and probably would have gone to slavery, a lot of them, but they would have lived, right? But they preferred death to slavery.
Wow, that's actually a really wonderful explanation you gave. Yeah, because, you know, the Greeks would have surrendered. The Egyptians had been conquered by a number of different peoples for years. So I get the sense that, not to be stereotypical, but the Eastern peoples, including the Greeks, I hate to say, had become, like, in a sense, docile and used to being ruled. And that's a stereotype the Romans would have used, but in a sense it's true. So I think the exception is the Judeans, like the Jews who...
The Jews were very, I mean, we discussed this off camera, but they...
Yeah.
It was a problem. It was a problem.
It was a problem in a sense. They were behaving in a way like the Celts were. But in a sense, the Celts never resisted really again. So it's interesting, the Germanic peoples and the Jews, whose history would intersect later, the most rebellious people to the Romans, right? Even the Jews, obviously, they had land to protect, to preserve. They had pragmatic reason to cooperate with Rome, but they didn't. I think we should, that's a topic for a different video, because we could
spend a lot of time on the Jews.
There's a lot to talk about. Anyway, but another related reason about who is a Roman, right? Notice that, I think this is related to your explanation, in Western Europe, right? Roman culture and the legacy is preserved, right? The Roman language, Latin, in its modern forms, Spanish and French. There's a lot more probably genetic influence too, because they're tribal societies, right? It's probably easier. Well, it's harder to get them to submit, but once you do, you can like wipe many of them out, which they did. It's probably because they were not literate societies, right? They didn't really have right the Celts there. You could give them, you could basically make a new history, right? And so the people of Gaul and the people of Spain were entirely transformed, their identity. So this is what I call conquest. What do I call it? Type 2 conquest, which is basically cultural conquest. It's not just political and administrative and legal rule, but you transform the entire identity of the people, right? Which the Romans did. Yeah. But when the Romans conquered the Eastern Mediterraneans, the Greeks, the Judeans, the Syrians, and the Egyptians, it was only a type 1 conquest. It was only legal. The Romans only ruled in a political, legal, and administrative sense. The identities of the people more or less stayed the same. The languages of the people stayed the same. The religions of the peoples stayed the same. But in Western Europe, the Romans, the Celts never regained their identity, and probably because of their tribal nature. And also they didn't have any city. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I just wanted to add, I think a component of it could be typically tolerant of other religions, but the Romans were very opposed to Druidism because there's a human sacrifice was involved, right? So when you take away the religion, you kind of that breaks down the society as well. But sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah, please do. And in fact, the Phoenicians or the Carthaginians, who were Phoenician, and since the Carthaginians were Berbers, but they were also Canaanites, right? Like Semitic.
Yeah.
It has been archaeologically proven that the Roman accusation is true. They did human sacrifice, and they were wiped off the face of the planet. But I get the sense that the Carthaginians, like a lot of those, like because what do they call it? Punic languages. They survived, right? People still spoke Punic languages after Carthage fell, right? I'm sure that there were still peoples there, like scattered.
Oh, yeah, no, you don't really see the language transformations. Don't really in the East take place till the Arab conquests,
right?
Punic, you kind of had this hybrid tongue that emerged between like this Latin Punic tongue that people attest to hearing, but that because once the Arabs come, also especially if we look at North Africa specifically, we're talking about there's the settled, which is on the coast, and then you have the nomadic Berber tribes, which were never really conquered by the Romans.
Right.
So when the Arabs and the Romans did not, they destroyed Carthage, but like all these Hippo Regius, Cirta, there's other cities. It's just I think the Gasti, these various North African cities that were Phoenician. They weren't destroyed, so the population stayed there. You don't really. When the Arabs come, you really see this massive population displacement. And like when they conquered Carthage, the Romans, I mean, they destroyed Carthage in the Third Punic Wars, but then they rebuild it, and becomes the capital of North Africa, the province. When the Arabs destroy it, the remnants of the population that is able to avoid slavery flees on ships to Constantinople.
Really?
Yeah, there was an exodus.
Wow,
of the settled population. A lot of people fled because it was really a lot of that was the convulsions. It was kind of the end of an era. Not everyone left, obviously, but a lot of people, those that were able to flee with the Roman fleet, did do so.
Yeah.
There's a Berber population that initially resists. They're mostly pagan, some are Christian, but then that's when that region changes culture and identity. So completely, because, like I said, the settled population that had dominated the coast was eliminated.
Yeah.
Really, for the first time, and since I guess when the Phoenicians founded their colonies there, right? So then they drove the Berbers into the interior.
Yeah. I could imagine the same thing happening in Alexandria. Like a lot of Greeks fleeing when the Arabs come.
Oh, there was a massive. They besieged the city, and the Romans knew they couldn't hold it.
Yeah.
So not everyone flees, but those that could got on the ships, right? And they fled again. You had a lot of exiles in Syria too, and then one of the Syrian exiles created Greek fire. So
Oh wow.
yeah. So, but yeah, a lot of people flee because they knew the end. The end. It was the end of an era, right? So not everyone, obviously, not everyone could flee, right? So priority is going to go to the military forces that are there, right? Because those forces are going to be needed to defend. At the time, it was good. When I think Alexandria fell in 646 to the Arabs, and so they're going to be using Anatolia or maybe to defend other places in Africa, which was still because Carthage doesn't fall to 698. So you have Africa lasts for a while.
Yeah.
But then you have the more wealthy elements of society, like the Greeks probably they're going to escape by ship, but a lot of the populations,
So the native Egyptians obviously would just stay there and be converted or assimilated.
Yeah.
So really, the Roman Empire doesn't end with the Roman Empire. The idea of the Roman Mediterranean rule doesn't really end until the Arab conquest. That's the end of the Roman Empire, in my view, in terms of to the extent that it really matters, because Rome had dominated those eastern centers for centuries and centuries. And it's the end of the Hellenistic era of Hellenistic culture.
Absolutely.
So,
because because even the places that for instance, in Anatolia, which had been Greek since Alexander conquered, Ionia had been Greek since as far back as you go in antiquity, right?
Yeah.
But Alexander conquered it, right? But then you have the decay of classical civilization because that becomes a war zone. So you have to. It's really the end of an era because yes, they lose the Mare Nostrum is over because even when the Western provinces are lost, the Roman fleet is unchallenged. The Germanic tribes are not. The Vandals had a fleet, right, and they caused some problems. But after the destruction of the Vandal fleet, so that's in the mid 6th century. So for 100 years, it's again a Roman lake because it's the Visigoths or the Franks. They're not challenging the naval supremacy.
Right, and that's interesting because these Germanic tribes, Germanic dynasties, I'm sure they were very few in number in terms of. I'm sure they were outnumbered by the native Roman population. They really kind of. I don't know. They didn't really feel antagonistic necessarily toward the Byzantines, right? Because the Roman Empire collapses in Italy when that one tribal chieftain sends a letter to Constantinople informing the emperor that there's no longer a need to send a Western emperor, right? Because that's what they'd done in the 5th century. The Byzantine emperor had sent basically a client king to Rome, or puppet king, as the Western emperor. But the Germanic tribes are very cordial and saying, look, it's over now, we rule. There wasn't, maybe I because there was a huge war, right? That's one exception with the Ostrogoths, right, between the Eastern Romans and the Ostrogoths. But like the Visigoths, they don't seem to be hostile to Byzantines. Obviously, they're on the opposite side of the sea, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a war, right? Because Justinian is able to establish Roman control of southern Spain for a brief period, nothing, a few decades. I think, I think it was by the end of this. I don't. You can look up the dates. I forget exactly, but it was the province of Spania, right? And then even at the end of the Gothic War, I think they call it the Battle of Tagenai. The Franks thinking they could exploit like the chaos, right, in Italy after the expulsion of the Ostrogoths. They're like, let's see if we could, and the Romans and the Eastern Romans are able to defeat the Franks. I don't want to say it's not entirely peaceful, but there's a respect. There's a sign of, They
Definitely.
acknowledged the supremacy of the Romans. And outside the Gothic War, which was brutal, it really led to the destruction of classical civilization in Italy, because all the major population centers are, Milan, or Mediolanum, as it was called back then, is razed to the ground. Rome goes back and forth several times between the Goths and the Eastern Romans. So Italy becomes like a bloodbath, and they win, and Italy's destroyed, and then the Lombards come,
Yeah, and then
and
that's another.
then in the Eastern Romans, you have renewed war with Persia, the Avars, and other nomadic tribes bearing down the Balkans. Italy's peripheral, but since Italy was so devastated, you couldn't like bring up like a new like local legionnaires. You needed to import troops back from like the heart, but they didn't have the resources. They
Yeah,
didn't have the resources. So then you kind of have Italy becomes you have like the coastal regions around Rome, Naples, and Ravenna, which was the capital. Um, they maintain control, but the inland regions, the north, that's all overrun by the Lombards.
yeah,
So it was kind of like this happens like not too long after Justinian's death,
yeah.
and in
How?
565 he dies. So it was kind of like a wasted. The only substantive reconquest in the West is really North Africa, because that survives, and that and it's pretty prosperous until the Arabs come. And then Carthage doesn't fall until 698, and you have the
Yeah,
initial Arab conquest in 632, so you have like it survives for over 65 years. And it was reconquered in the fifth. So it was under their rule for over 100. It was under back under for over 100 years, and the history is fascinating. It's
yeah.
fascinating.
It just goes to show you like how removed we are from these eras of just constant in warfare. Again, how pampered our society is. Like we just have all this consumerism and materialism, and we forget how, like, the fact that certain ethnic groups like the Jews and the Greeks even survive these periods of turmoil and upheaval is it's just remarkable, right? Um, I don't know. I think we've lost a great sense of kind of the militarist ethos in human culture, and the West is at fault for that, I would say. And you don't see it in the Islamic world. Like they are battle hardened and ready to go. Even people in the streets of Damascus who are not militants have lived with warfare for years. And uh, especially we in the United States, uh, we're pampered. We haven't had a war on our shores in 150 years. And I don't know what. Just to think of the mentality of people during the later Middle Ages who had to live with constant raids, like slave raids, civil war between feudal lords. It's astonishing to see. It's almost as if they were a completely different species in a sense from modern man. I don't know what you think, but
No, I'm in agreement. I mean, think about this, like, and even like you look at like the modern era, right? Like people compare like World War II, like I think 600,000 Americans die, right? And you see like the crazy outrage over like 3,000 people dying in Iraq. I know every human life matters, right?
yeah,
But we're comparing just in the modern era. Then we go even further back, and like and just the convulsions of war and how much people live with daily violence.
yeah,
Violence was a hallmark of society,
yeah, yeah.
and, and we're just so far removed from that. I think people can comprehend. That's why I think the study of history makes you appreciate the present. I mean, we have problems, right? And and I don't want to diminish the problems of the present, but when you look at like what our ancestors had to deal with, the crucibles of conflict and struggle,
Yeah.
whether it be with the Arabs, the Vikings, whatever, what have you, the Mongols, like all these different people, and like the stuff that people complain about nowadays is like grow a pair.
In the ancient world, you would have been a slave and fighting as a gladiator for somebody else's entertainment. and they would pull your intestines out just for fun. There's no one thing that's interesting to compare the Roman Empire and the United States is the Romans sustained many losses, right? Loss after loss after loss. The Roman Republic, during the Roman Republic, they lost hundreds of thousands of troops, right? Hundreds of thousands, oftentimes, against Carthage, and they still reconstituted themselves. And in the United States, we lose 19 in Somalia, and that's a scandal.
It's the end of the world. It's the end of the world.
Right, yeah. In a sense, it's, and we, every day, you and I, we talk about the chaos that's going on, but in a sense, social media has amplified the sense of crisis, right? Whereas before we just read on the page, 100 people slaughtered in Damascus. Oh, okay. But right,
in a way, it makes us numb to violence, which I would say our ancestors were to an extent.
Right, yeah.
But the amount of violence, the casualties, it doesn't compare to what it was in the past. It doesn't.
Yeah.
I mean, but I guess if we were to act like it's not a big deal, and we just let it happen. I mean, I get there's something we want to try to like rectify the problems, right? I don't know, we want to try to like make things better. So,
the last issue today, and I actually have dinner here. I need to eat, but
yeah, I don't want to deprive you from your meal. We don't want you to starve like the poor souls of Elysia.
Right, yeah. My trip through the Congo here. Anyway, what you were saying something earlier about Byzantine, like about Eastern or Christianity having a harder time in being imposed either in the East or West, like
the West.
Yeah.
Oh, about that. I was like, there was a distinction in the Eastern and Western Empire, right? Christianity was an Eastern religion. It comes from that kind of that whole melting pot out there in Palestine and Syria. And so the morality, the ethics of that region, Christianity stems from that. It's Jewish. It's an evolution of Judaism. It was originally viewed by the Romans as a form of Judaism. They didn't really see a distinction until much later. So these thoughts were alien to the West. So I think it was harder to convert Westerners because it wasn't in something they were necessarily familiar with now. But with the East had a preponderance of wealth and power, and those emperors constantly shifted the focus of the empire from Rome to Constantinople, right? And then we were talking earlier about the Battle of Frigidaus, where Theodosius, who made Christianity official religion of the empire, which Constantine did not do. He gave it an imperial favor. It was favored by the state, but it wasn't the official religion of state. Where Theodosius defeats the usurper Eugenius, who, though Christian, was a pagan sympathizer. And so you have this imposition of Christianity on the Western Empire that facilitates the conversion. But I guess what I was pointing to you in a previous conversation was that unlike in the East, where it kind of spread more through word of mouth, proselytizing, and then the incorporation of Greek philosophy helped to make it more accessible to a greater audience, because Judaism is a very insular religion, right? But when you expose it to the Hellenism and all the ideas that stem from that tradition, it makes it more of a universal faith, because the Hellenistic impulse was that Roman Romanitas, which is the name of this chat. These are like kind of universalist aspirations, whereas Judaism is not. Even though its ideas obviously could have wider currency. But again, this was not something familiar to the West. It had to be imposed by the state, closing of temples and and then you kind of have the Senate aristocracy has to remake itself after the defeat of Eugenius as this the bastion of traditional Roman pagan values now becomes the great papal families. I mean, typically like Gregory the Great, the Pope to confronted Attila, and these people are descendants of Roman senators, but
Oh, really?
they
Interesting.
remade themselves as the pape as the clergy, and a lot of the great a lot of these great you hear about these great clerical figures of
Church
bishops
father.
and popes. These were people who, with the aftermath of the fall of the Roman Empire, where secular power is now in the hands of Germans. So the creation, in many ways, the church reassert the church claiming the Roman mantle is really like the surviving Roman families, the Roman aristocracy, saying like, "Hey, we're players still too. So we're now the clergy. We have a monopoly on spiritual power. Our we're the kind of the medium between God and the temporal realm. So you need us. We have a role to play in
Right.
this new world. So it's kind of
And also,
it's them trying to stay relevant in a changing world because they were deprived. These families were deprived of their secular authority by the Germans.
that's actually really fascinating. I remember reading my book, History of Western Society, about that transition, how in the later Roman Empire, the brightest minds, the brain power was funneled out of like civic and law and politics into clergy, right? And in fact, when the Germanic tribes take over Spain, Italy, and Gaul, right, they don't, they actually maintain the local system, right? Right. The Roman, the Roman clergy, the Roman civic authorities are allowed to be maintained because they know how to write, right? They understand civic administration. They can maintain the infrastructure, the civic infrastructure. And it seems like what you're saying is something I didn't realize. I didn't realize that there was that so direct a link. I mean, that the families, old Roman families that survived and maintained prestige, almost realize that they have a new outlet for maintaining their rule because clerical authority also had some civic power, right? I mean, they conduct the census. I'm sure they may have helped with tax. They help with
Oh yeah,
domestic administration. So that's interesting that and they form a symbiotic relationship with the new Germanic overlords uh, in the West. Now, you actually said that in the East they have an easier time adopting Christianity. Maybe it's because Eastern mystery religions are already present. Christianity seems similar. They're more familiar with Judaism. Also, there's more of an Eastern Mediterranean side to Christianity, love your neighbor, mercy, love, all those things. Whereas in the West, Western Europe and the Western Mediterranean, there's still Europe hardy and rebellious. And so there's a difference of character, even though so.
no, yeah, no, yeah. No, the Greeks they kind of serve as a conduit between East and West. Because even though the Greeks, and I don't know, I'm hearing like my echo. I don't know. That's kind of fun. Um, just hearing yourself speak. Yeah, but the Greeks, even though they form the base of Western civilization, and in later periods they become distinct, right? They're kind of this middle ground between what is traditionally the Orient and then Western Europe. Um, you know, it's interesting. I mean, because I mean they in their foundation or in their origins, they're very much influenced by the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Phoenicians,
Yes,
but they also have their own ideas, which are so
right.
unique in human history that it can then kind of they gain currency and cachet in the West, not in the East.
Europeans are closer to their tribal history, to their tribal lineage, right? Even though there have been tribes in the Middle East, Europe has been urbanized more recently, right?
Yes.
It goes back 3,000 years before the first cities in Europe, even in Greece. So maybe that's why the people in the Middle East and Egypt have been domesticated earlier to be more the scientific method.